Well, welcome to you from the Woodbridge Historic Preservation Commission. We're really delighted to have with us this afternoon Elizabeth Reeves, who is a historic architect and works for the Facilities Department at Rutgers University. One of her main tasks down there, of course, is helping to maintain their historic buildings. And if you've been to Rutgers campus, you know they have a multitude of historic buildings. So it's her job in terms of doing that to make sure that it's done right. And all of the research and everything that goes into that is all a part of what she does on a regular basis. And she's been very helpful to the Historic Preservation Commission in terms of understanding the nature of historic architecture and what's important about that. So she's agreed to talk to us today about how to take the historic home that you may have and to find out all the necessary things about it, trace its history, trace the ownership of the house, and do a whole variety of things like that. So we're very delighted to have Elizabeth with us here today, and we hope you'll enjoy the program.
First, I want to thank you all for coming. It's actually a pleasure to do this. I do numerous presentations over the course of the year, but the educational programs are really my favorites. And as Father Bob said, you know, I'm employed at Rutgers doing this, but I've been doing research into historic buildings for about 30 years now. And it's more than really a career or a profession. It's more of a passion. I do it in my spare time. It's my happy place. So anyway, just to mention that this workshop is sponsored duly by the Woodbridge Township Historic Preservation Commission and the Friends of the Library. So I thank you all very much for inviting me here today. The purpose of this is actually to teach you how to become a historic house sleuth. Frequently at Rutgers, they call me Sherlock Holmes because I dig up all of this information that previously wasn't known. Now, the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and historic architecture is indicated by this diagram that somebody definitely has too much time on his hands, because he identified Sherlock Holmes' Baker Street home down to the pipe stems and the bookcases. So I found it very interesting because that's what we need to do. As an overview, we're going to talk about observing and documenting your historic properties, and that includes photos, floor plans if they're available, details. We're going to talk about research, beginning with precedents. In other words, structures that are very similar to yours. We're also going to talk quite a bit about the broad knowledge of historical events, industry, transportation, economics, politics, and culture. Buildings don't drop out of the air and land on the earth. They're usually caused and appear as a representation of some kind of a culture or other influence. Woodbridge itself not only has the historical events, it had the industry, it had the transportation, certainly it had the politics, and it developed its own culture out of these things. We're going to talk about using maps for research, genealogy for research. I'm going to walk you through deed research and the important features, published histories, and just recently I've been working on a property where I've been going around my area interviewing some of the older people, the long-timers, and gaining actually a lot of information, not necessarily about the architecture, but about how things were used and how the communities grew. Finally, we're going to talk about using your imagination to connect the dots. This is where the Sherlock Holmes comes into play, because you find little clues in all of your buildings. And each little clue is really important. Once you've developed all of your clues, then you need to make sense of them, and I call that connecting the dots. Now this is a case study of a building that I've been recently researching up on the Old Mine Road in Sussex County. The original building dates to 1830, and then it was modified in 1920. So it's sort of an ideal time frame for Woodbridge because of the growth of the community. The building itself, the 1830 part, is built of stone, and that's because stone was an indigenous material up in the Delaware Water Gap area. It's very rocky up there, and it was easy to carve the stone out of the ledges. In Woodbridge, however, your indigenous material is clay. So consequently, a lot of your older buildings here in town, particularly the large kind of notorious buildings, are built of brick. But a lot of you may discover that your foundations are actually built of brick because it was made here. It was a local material and it was inexpensive. This is just a photograph that I had taken of the old stonework of the building, and this is what I mean about looking for clues. There's several different types of stonework on this site, and each one represents a different era. Looking at the roofs, you frequently can discern additions that were made over a period of time. Houses don't tend to stay static. Every time it changes ownership, people need different spaces. They don't conform to the house. They make the house conform to them. We haven't entirely figured out this house yet. We haven't looked at all of the additions yet. Obviously, the section on the left in the bottom photo appears to be either an addition or the original portion of the house. We're not sure. You'll also notice that there's different slating on both of those roofs. Now, the building was occupied up until 1978, so you can see all the damage that's been done over the last 30 years. So it made it a little bit tougher to do this building. Now, in addition, we were really lucky with this building because we actually had a date carved into stone. So we knew exactly when the building was built. What we didn't know was what all the ethnographics meant. There is initials NST carved in the stone, a heart, 2 eyeballs, a crescent moon, and a bunch of stars. So it was a real mystery. But we're looking at the detail here to try to figure out what this building was. It's listed as a house, and in 1920 it was listed as the quintessential vacation house of the 1920s up in the area. But I'm not convinced. So that's another aspect of researching your house. You need to approach it with skepticism. Don't believe everything that you read. There are primary sources, there are secondary sources, and even published works sometimes are not correct. In addition, we took a look at the doors and hardware. Now, we know the house dates to 1830, so one would expect then that the door trim, obviously this is an original door, it actually has the original hardware on it. We also took a look at the windows, and these are typical of the period. You'll notice that the window is actually splayed out through the stonework. A couple of reasons here. Glass was very expensive, so the panes were small. The other thing is that with the splay, and particularly whitewashed splay, is it reflected the light deeper into the house. I just want to point out too, the Delaware Water Gap, in addition, was part of the frontier even in 1830. And there were a lot of conflicts, particularly after the War of 1812. There were differences still occurring with the Native Americans who felt cheated out of their land. So a lot of these houses were used also for protection. Now, some of the window details, you can see the window on the right. We're looking at the splay. And I found what I thought originally was a piece of garbage on the floor, but it just happens to match the window opening exactly. So it was more than likely a shutter. When you're looking at your older houses, particularly the ones that predate about 1870, remember there were the water sources. Running water was not a common thing. It was reserved for the wealthy. You might have had a pump inside the house. Back in the 1830s, of course, we had wells, and we were lucky enough to find the well covered with slate, and then the spring outflow. Now, last weekend we actually did remove the slate and discovered the well is still filled with water. Of course, the top of the well is now missing. It would have been stone, probably up about 3.5 to 4 feet. The fact is that the well still exists. Now, why that's important is because they also didn't have bathrooms. So we had to consider where was the outhouse, the Johnny, and it would have been away from the well, so it was probably on the other side of the house. Now, as you're looking at your houses, again, if it predates this indoor plumbing, typically what they did is they planted lilac trees next to the outhouse for the scent. So on your property, the landscape details are even important. So if you have an old lilac tree growing in your property, you probably found the outhouse location. Outhouses were used for other things aside from toileting, and they were primarily garbage dumps. So when we find an outhouse location, we think we found gold, because if you dig down far enough, you're going to find a lot of artifacts from the period when the house was built. Next feature, and this is a really big feature, we still have this feature floating around, are the fireplaces. Now, we were lucky because this building still contains the original fireplace in the 1830 part, and it still has some of the fireplace hardware. It has the brackets for the cranes. It is lined with stone. In addition, the hearth, and this is something that nobody picked up in the written descriptions, the hearth is level with a new flagstone floor. They call it a new flagstone floor. However, they wouldn't have put flagstone over top of wood. It was either originally a dirt floor or a stone floor. Now, this little tiny detail led us to the conclusion that this maybe wasn't used as a house. Stone floors are typical of taverns in the early colonial days because people sat at one big table drinking and eating and spilling things. So in order to clean up the floor and prevent a wood floor from soaking up all these odors, they used stone. That way, all they had to do was throw a bucket of water onto the stone. It cleaned the floor, and the water filtered out in between the stones. So this was a clue that the experts overlooked. And, we haven't lifted up any of the flagging yet, but I have a feeling I know what's going to be underneath it. That's based on experience. Now, upstairs, we found another period fireplace directly over the 1830 fireplace, which probably indicates a sleeping quarters. Now, old taverns and whatnot, particularly if they were stagecoach stop, you didn't lease a room. You leased a place in a bed. So there could be up to 6 people in the same bed. And if this was leased out, there would have been 1 or 2 beds in here with the fireplace for heat. The fireplace on the right-hand side is the 1920 fireplace. It's also built of stone. The flooring here is hardwood, in bad shape, but nonetheless in hardwood. But it's very indicative of that 1920s resort type design. I was able to find documentation at the state on this house. Now, I have looked in Woodbridge, and I have not found any documentation on residential properties with the state, unfortunately. But this does give you a sample of what the documentation would be for a house. And it's basically a description of the property. This was the official letter written by the state of New Jersey. But here is an enlargement of the description. And it talks really to the physical properties of the buildings and the landscapes. Now, there are 2 buildings on this site. One is a barn built in the 20s, and then we have this original house in the 30s with the 1830 with the 1920 addition. Again, this is another attachment to the official worksheets that are filed with the state, and it includes, again, that exterior description, but now it includes an interior description of all the important features. So, for example, if I go back to the fireplace, if I wasn't documenting the interior, then I wouldn't know that this building probably had another use besides a home. It also talks about the setting. Now, the 1920s owner, the fellow who put on the major stucco addition, also was a famous horticulturalist from New York. So the property is filled with all kinds of exotics. We also have the history. Now, the history of the property goes far beyond just the deed and the title. It talks about the environment. It talks about the culture, because that's all part of what caused this building to be and be where it is, and its use. It also goes into the significance of the building, and then a justification of why it is eligible for historic designation. Now, part of the commission's work is to initiate a plaque program for houses in the community. So an abridged version of this is anticipated along with the application to the commission for approval. Not at the level of the state, but this is importance to the growth and development of the community of the township of Woodbridge, and it includes all of the communities. What we see as significant sometimes becomes very obvious, like the Barron Arts Center. We all recognize as being a significant piece of architecture. What we don't usually consider to be significant are the small houses, what I call the vernacular, or the homes where the bulk of the populace lived, that were developed for a completely different reason. I believe at the end of the session we have an information sheet on the plaque program. What will happen with this paperwork is that it will be housed here in the library as a database now for important buildings in the history of Woodbridge. It's an incredible resource. I was mentioning last night, my daughter recently purchased a house, and she went to the ends of the earth looking for a post-World War II Cape Cod house. She wanted something historic, but she didn't want a white elephant and be saddled with an old Victorian. So she considers the post-World War II Cape Cod as historic. And those are the things that we tend to forget. We're so accustomed to it, but she's 25, so the next generation coming up looks at things a little bit differently. The structural system was also looked at. You'll notice that the beam is one single piece of beam. In the center of the beam at the bottom, you'll notice that there are saw marks. So obviously this was milled at a sawmill. Typically the old wood beams would still have the rotating saw markings. Many of you, particularly in the older homes, may find this down in your basements. The other thing of note is the width of the floorboards. Now there is nothing between the floorboards and the first floor. So the boards are random width. They're very wide boards. Some of them are up to 14 inches wide. It's indicative of the 1830 period. Again, depending on how old your house is, you may find this. Now, older homes may be older than you think they are, because the people who lived in these communities were very frugal. And frequently they would embed houses within houses. My family farm has been in the family since 1737. And the original farmhouse is still there. My cousins own it, and when they decided to remodel their kitchen, they found the original log cabin that was built in the 1700s in the walls. And they invited the family up to look at the logs before they covered it up to put in a modern 1960s kitchen. So you never know what you're going to find. But when you're down in a basement where you have something exposed that you can see, sometimes it helps you identify how old your house might be, or additions that may have been made to your house over a period of time. In addition, as you're researching a house, and I was lucky enough to find a copy of an old will in one of the history books that I was reviewing, and it mentions the succession of property to the owner who built the 1830s building. Now, the original, patriarch of the family, his house is pictured there up at the top. And it's strikingly similar to his son's building. So we can kind of use that as a model. And the reason I say that is I'm looking at the stonework, I'm looking at the pitch of the roof, and I'm looking at the size of the windows. Very, very similar. However, we did happen to find this will that indicates that this fellow's property, which was a large piece of property, was divided among his sons, one of which was Daniel and Joseph, and they appear on maps as being owners of this property. Now, I went all the way back and found a Dutch map from the 1600s of the Delaware River and the vicinity in which this house was located. The map is interesting because it does show colonies and European development, but up in the area where we're looking, which is the top center, it indicates all of the Native American villages. So I haven't had a chance to go out there and look look up those villages. I have not been able to find a similar map of the Woodbridge area, and I have been looking. I have been looking because this property was originally purchased from the Native Americans back in the 1600s, before the charter was granted to the township. This was the existing official record. Now, I'm going to be leaving here in the library with Wendy a list of resources, websites and whatnot, where you can actually do some of your research. I got lucky in that this property was listed. The trick was that it goes by the 1920s name instead of the 1830s name. So identifying the fact that this building was called Heron's Nest was a rather difficult thing. So you want to be very careful, particularly if you have a named property, which is highly likely here in Woodbridge, that you're using truly the historic name. Now, this is how we connect the dots, okay? By reading our histories, we discover that the building was built by Mason Nicholas Tillman and the carpenter Reuben Shoup. So we have NST in the stone. We have Nicholas Tillman and Reuben Shoup. Now the property happened to be built by a member of the Ennis family. They came from the Scotland, Ireland area of the United Kingdom, and as we go through the genealogy, we discovered that sometimes it is spelled Ennist. So obviously the builders had a sense of humor, and they put together Ennist, which I thought was incredibly creative. And it took me about a week to figure that one out. The 1830, of course, is the date. Now, in also doing my reading, because the crescent moon I recognize typically as a Freemasonry symbol, but the English Freemasonry has a single star. This has more than one star. So I dug a little bit deeper, and based on the genealogy of the Ennis family, discovered that the Scottish Irish had a different version of Freemasonry in this country that developed in the later half of the 18th century. It was very well organized. This family happened to be Scottish Irish, and interestingly enough, those were the original settlers of Woodbridge, were Scottish Irish. So that's something that, in fact, you may want to look for. What we're thinking is that perhaps this was some kind of a Masonic lodge, given that it was a tavern. The location was in the heart of this section of the community. The Old Mine Road is 127 miles long. This is right in the middle. It's not on the river, and it's in between the road and the river. So it's not likely that it was a residence. We don't have, the building is too small to be a farm of that date. So we haven't been able to prove any of this yet, so the research is ongoing. And that's what makes this profession, passion so interesting, is looking for the answers. And again, we found the genealogy dating back to Scotland, or the Scottish-Irish area. We found the double spellings of the name and when it was changed here in the United States. So we can document that NST very easily. The patterns of growth and development now down here in Woodbridge, as you're trying to work on identifying your house, you need to look at the big picture. Woodbridge was settled very, very early on. So it does appear on the 1685 map as a hub, okay? Just because it wasn't chartered yet doesn't mean that it wasn't settled, okay? The location, and reading these maps is a little tricky because they're, first of all, in Dutch, number one, excuse me. But number two, cartography at the time was very rough. So as you're looking for and finding old maps of Woodbridge, you have to remember that a lot of them are hand-drawn. Woodbridge is lucky because it was surveyed at a very early period of time. It was surveyed back in the 1600s when the charter was granted. It encompassed a lot more territory than it does today, but it was divided into parcels, and they ranged anywhere from 50 acres to 500 acres. It was in the charter that the township had to have 60 families. It was originally settled by 30 families, 10 of whom were major stockholders or landowners in the township. Now, ironically, the old township had 10 different communities. And this just dawned on me as I was doing this presentation. And I was trying to identify the smaller communities in the township and discovered that most of them were the 500-acre farms. That's how they started out. And each one took on its own name. This is a 1867 map, but this one is very useful. And this one happens to be in the library. But what's really useful, even though this isn't a great image of it, is that it shows the buildings, shows the street layouts, it shows the clay pits, it shows the waterfront, and it also has names of the owners on it. Incredibly useful map. Now, until about 1856, Woodbridge was a very isolated community. It was a stop on the route from New York to Philadelphia, but eventually it was bypassed as newer roads were constructed to a much more direct route. So Woodbridge was sort of left out in the cold. And I know from putting together some of this history, it's very, very difficult to find information on Woodbridge. It's horribly difficult. This map happens to be a real find. It's in the heart of Woodbridge, becoming part of a larger community now, becoming on the main road. And a lot of that, if you notice the clay pits there, a lot of it is because of its industry. Again, by 1878, we have major links to Woodbridge, particularly between Newark and Perth Amboy. It was the direct route. So we had major ports at both ends of the route. We had major industry here in Woodbridge. So not only did we have a major industry, we also had good avenues to export that material to other places, particularly Newark, Perth Amboy, and eventually New York, where the brick was used to construct buildings of the period. Now, 1878, around the Civil War, buildings of brick were very, very common. Almost all of them, particularly in railroad towns, were constructed of brick. So your main streets and whatnot, I'm from Newton. We have a historic feature that we call the Brick Row because it's a row of stores totally made of brick. We happen to have a brickyard in town. Now, being that I work in New Brunswick, a lot of the brick, working on these older buildings, I find the the foundry or the factory marks in our brick. So we have a small collection going of all of the different brick companies, just so that we know what we need to match in our houses. And it's mostly houses that the university has taken over. We also had the coming of the railroads. Now this was a major, major linkage of Woodbridge to the outlying areas, the major ports and the major cities. It made Woodbridge a very bustling town. It caused the clay industry to blossom. We had ports developing now because we could transport goods from Woodbridge into the interior, as far west as Pennsylvania, as far south as Camden and Philadelphia, and up into New England. I just wanted to show you a little figure of what some of the trains might have looked like, because the trains came to Woodbridge at such an early date. They were really just developing. So we have the wagon-drawn, horse-drawn trains that used what was called a narrow gauge track. These were quite common in industrial applications, actually. It was a convenient way to move heavy materials. And then, of course, technology began to develop steam engines. Eventually the diesel. We have coal-fired, we have wood-fired. So there were a variety of trains that were moving through Woodbridge. Now this doesn't happen to be Woodbridge, but it's a pretty good depiction of what a bustling railroad town, industrial town, might have looked like. So remember, the roads weren't paved, they were dirt. The avenues were broad, the streets were narrow. We have the port, you can see the water in the distance. This is so similar to what Woodbridge might have been. There was a major train depot down around Boynton Beach and Seawarren. So again, that would be a big transport point. The other thing that I was reading in some of the histories is that the creeks that are now running through Woodbridge weren't always creeks. There were ports that extended well into the city for the import of goods and the shipping of goods down to the major waterfronts. This is, I believe, the Boynton Beach Seawarren station. Now, I did this little map to show you where all the communities are in the township. They developed at different times for different reasons. And the only one that I haven't been able to identify yet is Keansby. So anyway, but most of them started out as these plantations, these 500-acre plantations. Now, as the properties were broken up and people started moving into these areas, they needed goods and services. And they didn't want to come all the way into Woodbridge to get milk, to get eggs, to get fabric to make their clothes, to have their shoes fixed, to get their meat butchered. So you have all these little, not municipalities, but communities that evolved around these agricultural areas. Eventually what happens is, as the clay industry develops, you have more and more people moving in. We have the big houses located and marked here in Woodbridge proper, okay? There are some outside of Woodbridge proper. However, they didn't work in the clay pits. They didn't work at the kilns. Who did? Well, a lot of immigrants coming to the United States about the same time that the clay works were evolving, they were the work people. Well, those work people have to live someplace. And that's what I find most fascinating about the entire township, is that all of these workers developed communities and housing developments around the clay pits. You'll notice that the dots create a ring around the township, the borders of the township. What's in the center? The clay pits. A lot of these communities were also divided up by nationality. So you have the Italians, the Hungarians, the Germans. I'm trying to think who else. There's a whole list of immigrants that came to the United States, Irish, as things were happening around the world. Now this is just a detail shot of Woodbridge off of this 1920 map. And this is a very useful map because we now have the street layout, which has evolved since 1920. But those of you who have older homes will probably find your street on this map. And that gives you a really good idea of how long your property has been there. And then, of course, the clay industry, as I mentioned, had everything to do with the growth of Woodbridge. The clay industry started very, very early on, in the early part of the 19th century, and eventually, notice the big building up in the back. Looks like one of the owner's houses. And then eventually it turned into these very large complexes. Now, the other part that gets really interesting about Woodbridge Township is that it also became a resort. The latter part of the 19th century, Seawarren, Boynton Beach, because of their waterfront locations, their beauty, they became resort areas. So you have a different type of development. Now you'll notice, aside from the boats in the water, take a look at the houses along the shore. Now, it was also in Seawarren where a fireproof clay house was developed. So we have a major technological advancement. We found up at Rutgers a fireproof house that was constructed of Woodbridge clay tile. So it obviously had an impact. The fireproof construction became very popular in the United States as towns started burning with all the wood structures. All it took was one barn fire, or in the case of Chicago, one wayward cow, and almost an entire city could go up in flames. So the use of these clay products was really, really important, and that's another reason why Woodbridge retains so many of its historic structures. And of course the Seawarren House, which was a major hotel. Now in the latter part of the 19th century, particularly the wealthy liked to escape the city. Woodbridge was close by. It provided a beautiful waterfront setting. You had an elegant hotel. So it was ideally situated to bring a lot of tourists. Now we have another industry going in Woodbridge Township, tourism. I believe this is the Boynton Beach Inlet. Again, another resort community developed by the Boynton family. I'm sure they made a fortune. I hope there's nobody in here who's related to a Boynton. As we take a look at the growth, now this is Woodbridge proper. you can see how broad the main street was. Okay. The few number of buildings, very early architecture, Dutch colonial, English, and of course the church. Now I've got to mention a little bit about the churches, because as these plantations evolved into communities, the church was the heart of every community. Its social life, moral life, everything revolved around the church. Courting took place in the churchyard. So in between church services on a Sunday, you were at church all day long. So in between, people would bring their picnic lunches, they would picnic in the cemetery, if you will. The young men and women would court there, they would get married there, they would baptize their children there, and they would die there. So as soon as you had a church built, which required a certain number of people, you had a community. This is another view of Woodbridge proper, but what's interesting about this, it's in the Fulton Street area. Most of these houses are very common. They're also called vernacular because they're developed in no one particular style, but with an eye to economy and practicality. On the right of this picture, you'll see a long block building. That was probably a boarding house. So young men who came to work in the playworks, who did not have a family, did not build a house, probably stayed in that boarding house. And again, this is the evolution of Main Street. Now, this is the Turner farmhouse in Port Reading, probably the original plantation. If we look up the Turners, I'm sure we will find that somewhere in the Turner family, they were given the initial 500-acre land grant. And we have our traditional brick structures. Now you'll notice that the brick is very decorative. This particular building happened to be built out of brick from Holland. Now a little bit about that. As the ships came over to this country from Western Europe, they came over empty. And they needed ballast in the bottom of the ship to keep it stable. The ballast was usually brick. Once they were here, they unloaded that brick, and that brick became building material. A lot of buildings were built then either in the lowland style, because the bricks were either yellow or red. Heavily patterned. This particular house has a pattern in actually the bonding of the brick. And of course, we begin to go through the styles. Now, this is a Gothic revival, expanded cottage. Obviously, it is the residence of a wealthy person. However, in the 1840s, 50s, a fellow by the name of Alexander Jackson Davis promoted the concept that what you lived in was representative of your morals and your ethics, and that the perfect building style was Gothic. So what it started amongst the working class was neighborhoods, particularly these industrial-oriented neighborhoods of Gothic revival cottages. They're very, very simple. Very steep roofs. Sometimes they have, your typical cathedral-type pointed windows, but they were very prevalent. Not only did he speak about the house, he also spoke about the yard and keeping the yard neat, because he felt that a well-kept yard represented the upstanding in the community of the blue-collar worker, and it improved the community. So it caught on as a philosophy. In addition, what was happening at this point in time is you had Catherine Beecher, who was the sister of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Excuse me? Thank you. I always get the two of them mixed up. Catherine Beecher was a efficiency expert. And she decided that the kitchen was a laboratory. So she began to do research into the kitchen, making it efficient. Up until this point in time, the home was a man's castle. So as the theories and philosophies evolved, the woman became relegated to operating the house, manning the kitchen, making sure everything got done efficiently, and the man was responsible for the outside of the house. So men tend to have a fetish with mowing lawns. That's where it began, okay? If you read things like Architectural Digest, you'll find that most of the interviews are with women on the inside of the house, but they'll talk to the man or interview the man regarding the design of the building. It's just a very, very interesting period of time. And then we get into the exotic buildings, many of which are still extant around the town. So they are spectacular buildings. They're beautiful. They're part of Woodbridge history. But we also have the working man's house. And they're very plain, very simple, not usually very big, family-oriented. Now finally, we get into researching deeds. Now this is a very, very scary task for a lot of people because it's a little complicated. Most of the time, it cannot be done on the internet or in a library, although that's beginning to change now as we're digitizing deeds. Deeds are filed as a matter of public record in the county clerk's office, which is up in New Brunswick. And they have a huge hall of records where all of these deeds, some surveys, are all filed. So you actually can look up the chain of ownership of your property. Now, the one thing that the deeds don't tell you all the time is when your house was built. It will tell you the exchange of the parcel of land. So you have to combine all of this stuff together to connect the dots. Now, when you get to the Hall of Records, what you're going to find is a series of books with numbers on them. And every deed has a book number and a page number. So once you find your book number, you can turn to the specific page of your deed. Now, my recommendation for those of you who have deeds newer than, say, 1960, is to start with your own deed. There will be a book and reference number on your deed. And the person from whom you bought it, there will be a reference number for the book and deed of that person. So you don't start at the rear, you start at the front end and you work backwards. Now, as of about 1930, most of these deeds do essentially a title search, which is incorporated directly into the deed. These deeds, and I know this is completely unreadable, this will, by the way, be in the library for your use as a resource. But this deed traces the property up in New Brunswick all the way back to its original patent in the early 1800s. So in one deed from, I think this is an 1898 deed, in one deed you can trace that property all the way back. Rutgers being the last owner, who we purchased it from, and then in the description, all of the book and pages are cited for each title transfer. It gets really interesting. Now, given the age of Woodbridge, some of you, I suspect, and particularly because the lots were surveyed back in the 17th century, in the 1600s, some of you may actually find handwritten deeds. If you go back all the way, you'll go back to the original property survey. I haven't done that yet, but you know, discovering and researching your home and community is an ongoing process. It's one step at a time. Some of these buildings I've spent years on. Some of the buildings, like the one up in the Water Gap, I only spent a couple of weeks on. So it gets tricky. It depends on what you find. Now, there are numerous resources. I do a lot of my research on the computer now because it is the digital age. The other thing that I'm able to do, because I do have the computer, is that I can take a graphic image, such as a map or a photograph, and I can enlarge it digitally so that I can read the details. It's a very, very useful tool. You know, if you don't have those capabilities, of course, a good magnifying glass and a good map drawer will work. Now, Wendy and I went through the map drawer here in Woodbridge, and there's a couple of very, very interesting maps in that drawer. I also went through the map drawers up at the New Jersey Archives and Alexander Library, and I had the staff going crazy looking for maps. But we did find a lot of maps. I also found that there are a lot of histories up in that library. Now, because there was very little written on Woodbridge itself, I actually went into Middlesex County histories. Many of these histories, particularly around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, were very, very detailed. And what they would do is they would go into a community and they would go street by street, identify the building, identify the owner, identify the use of the building, and you can almost track it on a good street map. So I know there is one on Middlesex County. I believe it's Middlesex, Somerset, and Warren, or Hunterdon counties, I believe. So I didn't locate that in the library. However, I did find some very, very interesting information there. I am sure that your local library here, because I haven't examined the stacks, has many, many more histories on Woodbridge. If anybody is so inclined, I think a good history of Woodbridge could be written. We have the Images of America, which is very interesting in terms of photographs. What we don't have is the long-term stories. I did a lot of picking apart, finding numerous details to put them all together. I'm just starting to do the development of the community, and I'm hoping that that will be a big help to you, and I will print out those maps to be housed here in the library so that it gives you an idea of when your neighborhood, when your street developed. And again, you're going to be using your imagination in connecting these dots. Finally, what style is my house? Okay. Whenever we talk about researching a house, it's usually the first question. It's sort of like buying a car. What color is it? So, but what style is my house can be a very complicated thing, particularly as you get into the smaller neighborhoods of Woodbridge. Again, vernacular architecture is not really anyone's style. The builders were usually either the family members or friends. Once in a while you had a carpenter. Architects didn't come on the scene until the late 1800s, early 1900s. So your carpenter or you were the designer and the builder. Now they did have pattern books available, but most of the pattern books, again, focused in on mansions and estates. There are a few that have the Gothic cottages in them. Typical house styles in Woodbridge. On the far left hand upper corner is a vernacular. It's a modification of a Gothic cottage. Right next to it in the top row is a Gothic cottage. Okay, it's often frequently referred to as a gingerbread or as a stick style. Now, the next one to the right, I love. This is a craftsman style cottage. My guess is it dates about to the late 1800s to around 1910, 1915. And although I haven't explored all of the back streets of Woodbridge, my guess is that you're going to find a lot of neighborhoods with this particular house type in it. The next house to the right is actually a Georgian, and that would date more towards the early 1800s. It was much more formal than a early 1600s, late 1600s type of dwelling, which was completely done for practical means. It was shelter, and they put them up as quickly as possible. Down in the lower left-hand corner, we have a brick Romanesque, which was popular again in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This style was developed in Boston by an architect by the name of Henry Hobson Richardson.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
The next one over, the little green and yellow one, that is another one of my favorite building types. Very common in the working class neighborhoods. It is called the American Four Square. Very common here in Woodbridge. I was noticing as I was coming into town today. They're all over the place. So the American Four Square was developed. It's called Four Square because there were 4 rooms on each floor with a stairway in the center. They were a derivative of the craftsman style house, an expansion of the craftsman cottage, if you will. And they were frequently available in kit form. So you could purchase one from Montgomery Ward or from Sears. And yet many of them were still stick-built. In other words, they were built from the ground up without the kit. But the houses from the kits were very, very inexpensive. Now these would have gone up around just before World War I. And just after World War I. Very popular house style. It was sort of in between the smallness of the cottage and the grandiosity of the Victorian. Had the high ceilings on the ground floor, large windows, the broad porch. It was very functional. The last one in the center row is an Italianate. Now that's a very high Victorian. One of the markers that I use for the Victorian age, the high Victorians were built by wealthy people usually as an expression not only of their wealth, but of their knowledge. They were collectors of various artifacts from around the world. Most notably, they were excavating ancient Greece, so they liked to get Grecian artifacts from the digs. The change really in the Victorian architecture happened with the sinking of the Titanic. So that is the marker I always used. That was the end of the Gilded Age and the end of these grand displays of wealth. Down at the bottom, the little gambrel roof is a Dutch colonial, which we also have a lot of in Woodbridge as a Dutch colonial revival. And that becomes a direct result of the culture of this particular area. Now I get into kind of these houses that nobody really thinks are historic, but they actually are. And that's the post-World War II development house, the ranch house. With all of the veterans returning from World War II, developments were set up beginning out on Long Island with a place called Levittown. Now there is also a place in New Jersey called Radburn, New Jersey, which was a closed community that was set up exactly the same way. They would take the same house, build it row after row. Sometimes they would reverse it. Now these communities are actually very popular as people have personalized these little houses. Different colors, landscaping, an addition here and there. But they're really very precious little buildings. And of course, this is similar to what my daughter wanted. So it's a generational thing, and it's hard for us to imagine that because our perspective is a little bit different. Now the next one over, the little line drawing, is actually a colonial era farmhouse. This would be a vernacular building. Wasn't necessarily symmetrical. It probably was a smaller building with an addition on it. Probably similar to what was built out on the larger plantations here in Woodbridge. If anybody finds one of these embedded in their house, you've got to let me know. And the last one is another post-World War II variation on the ranch house, and this is the bi-level house. And there's a lot of bi-levels here. So taking the map with the growth and development of the township, you have a pretty good idea now of what kind of architecture you're going to find in these neighborhoods. Also remember that lot sizes have gotten smaller. In developed areas like this, as property values go up, people subdivide their properties, so you have interruptions in these streetscapes and communities with newer houses, which don't usually fit in, unfortunately. The hope is with the plaque program that we begin to mark the elements original to a specific community. So the development of Woodbridge Township is not lost. And all of the communities are marked because Woodbridge Township is one large entity. It isn't any one thing. So when you think about the 1600s coming back down to 2010, you're growing from the outside inward. Now, there are resources available to you. These are two of my favorite books. The McAllister book is the one that I use most frequently because it divides these houses, as we just saw, up into little tiny pieces. It talks about windows and the number of panes in the windows and the style of doors and the pitch of the roof, the different sidings. So as you're going about trying to date your house, you can refer back to these encyclopedias. Now, they also have a grid in this book, which was way too small to put up on the screen, but it's a what-if grid. So as you're looking at your property and you notice, okay, I have a certain type of window, and you go to this grid and look up that type of window, it will tell you what styles to try. And then you can flip into the book and take a look at the individual styles. It's a very, very useful tool. The Rifkind book is really a staple. Great images in it. There are numerous others. It's just these happen to be my favorites, and I don't get a commission on sales of these books. And finally, this was one of the resources that I found up in the Alexander Library. And I thought it was very, very interesting because it goes all the way back to the original charter through almost 1800, through just the onset, if you will, of the clay industry. And I'm going to turn it over to Wendy, who can elaborate on the resources that are available to you here in the Woodbridge Public Library.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I learned a lot from this. It's really interesting. I'm going to do a couple of little housekeeping things first, and then I'm actually going to get back on the computer for a few minutes. As Elizabeth mentioned, the Woodbridge Township Historical Preservation Commission is undertaking a plaque program. We do have the general outlines here. The plaques are going to look something like this. They're 8 by 12 inches. They're going to match the historic markers that we've been putting on some of the notable properties around, and there'll be an application procedure, but we do have them here. I also want to make sure, in addition to thanking Elizabeth again, and all the commission, that this program was also sponsored by the Friends of the Library, and we thank them for their support. And we thank TV35 for covering us today. This program, for if you have friends who were unable to make it this afternoon, will be available on video on demand on the Woodbridge Township Television website, and we will link to it off of the commission website. So it'll be a way to share the information that Elizabeth has presented today with other people interested in this topic. Is that what I want? I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the resources we have here at the library. As Elizabeth said, it's a sleuth. You have to be a sleuth, a detective mission, and what we hope here at the library is that this is one of your stops. You may end up having to go to the county courthouse in Middlesex, to the special collections at Alexander Library at Rutgers, New Jersey Historical Society in Newark, or even to Trenton. But we might have some resources here that will be the stopping off point, or start to gather clues about the families who may have lived in your properties, to learn about the area, to learn to put your house or your street in its context. I brought a few things down here, some of the local histories that Elizabeth mentioned, Sanborn maps. But one of the great things about the visual age is the increasing availability of technology to make resources available that we never had before. So I want to highlight a couple of things that we've recently done here at the library that I think are really going to be the breakthrough into getting people into opening up some of the to giving us additional information on properties here in Woodbridge. Let's get to the library's website at woodbridgelibrary.org. We were very lucky a couple of years ago to receive a grant that allowed us to digitize our historic newspapers. All right. Oh, did I spell with library wrong? Okay. That's excellent.
Easy for us to see.
And this has given us a wealth of information that was just not accessible. We had some of these papers on microfilm, some we didn't. There was no way of searching them, there was no indexing. So to tie into one of the things Elizabeth was talking about earlier, I was playing around with some possible searches. This is what our township historic newspaper database looks like. And this, of course, is accessible in the library in our branches, but it is also accessible from your home computer. So not only can you search it, but you can actually view the newspapers. So you can select the decade you're searching, and this is not between 1900 and 1909. And if I put in Glyph Road, hopefully this will work again, which is in Seawarren. Came up with this mention from the Weekly Register from March 1902. I'm using the wireless, so it's taking a little bit of time to load. And I can zoom in and find this, again, this is from March 1902, and there is a little blurb that the Seawarren Land Company is booming their properties by a liberal use of printer's ink in the New York dailies. There were all sorts of advertisements in New York City papers to entice people to come out to beautiful suburban Woodbridge. As a result, the property on the corner of Cliff Road and Ferry Street has been sold. This is the last vacant lot on the waterfront. So this, automatically gives us a context in 1902, tells us about the land sales, identifies a specific property. So the newspaper databases can be used for, I was earlier playing around with Meinzer Street and Avenel, where I used to live, and Warden and Avenue and Hope Lawn, and, finding out when they were laying sewer pipes and all sorts of things. So this is a really invaluable resource for when we're looking for local information. One other thing I just want to point quickly, and you guys you're the first to hear it here, because we actually don't even have this on the library website yet. We've also received another grant to digitize some of our local history books and make them available on the Internet Archive at archive.org. And there will be a link off the library webpage once we complete the full project, but it's still in process. But if you search it put in Woodbridge Library in the search box, you can bring up, the first link is books contributed by Woodbridge Public Library, that's us. And you can see a list, and it includes the book that Elizabeth highlighted earlier, The Little Krieger History of Woodbridge. So that's available, as well as quite a bit of ephemera, things about speedways. But if you're researching particular families, if you're following up on leads like the Masonic, the Scottish rites of Masonic temple, different churches, in town, fire departments, all sorts of things, you know, we have, that you may be able to use this as a resource. One thing I wanted to point out to you, which is one of my favorite documents that we put up here. There's also Amy Breckenridge's little pamphlet on disappearing landmarks of Woodbridge Township, which is sort of a stroll around the town. And that's going to be available so that even if you can't get to the library, you may be able to access some of these materials. But this pamphlet, which is old war songs and new and old patriotic and national songs, and this is a tiny little pamphlet that was published during the Spanish-American War with patriotic songs that can, that you could you could sing. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can see that it was it was presented to the comrades of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, in the Spanish War, and associate societies and the Americans and Patriots of Woodbridge and vicinity. Now, first of all, let's start with the fact it says Woodbridge and vicinity. That meant Woodbridge was the center of what they were talking about, the surrounding area. But what's nice about this is, and it's not an uncommon format from what we see today. I recently got an advertisement to buy a page or an ad in my son's high school yearbook. This, I'll zoom out a little bit. This pamphlet sold advertising space to local businesses. And on the page for Woodbridge, and some of these you can see, Somerville or Plainfield. On this one for Woodbridge, where'd it go? There it goes. On this one for Woodbridge, somebody had annotated and these different stores of that long Main Street and off of Main Street. So Brown and Tappan, and they told us who had them. We see that Charles Drake was a druggist and stationery on Main Street and was a brother of Benjamin Drake. So we're all the time finding these resources, both here in the library. People are bringing them to the library as they discover them in their attics or taking down a wall in their kitchen, and it turns out it was used as insulation, and then these become, if we can make them available, become more clues in your home searches. So thank you so much for your time and your patience. I don't know if we want to take any questions or anything additional you want to add.
Thank you, Wendy, for your contributing of the resources of the library, too. That is indeed a great resource for all of us. I'm sure that Elizabeth and Wendy will be around for questions if any questions. Thank you all for coming.